Susan Newell, the last woman to be hanged in Scotland in 1923. Hello, I'm Brent, and this is Strange Embers. So for the little known background about Susan Newell, she was born in 1893, and little was known about her early life. What is known is it was said that she had a hard life and constant poverty as she was growing up. And this was during a period of time when Scotland was having a lot of social and economic changes as well. After Susan had completed school, she worked various low-paying jobs before she decided to move to Glasgow in 1910 when she was 17 years old. Once arriving there, Susan again worked in a series of low-paying jobs again before she met and married John McLeod. He was a 24-year-old gentleman from Lewis. And like Susan, he had also moved to Glasgow looking for a better life. So when the war broke out in 1914, John signed up to join the military, and he was sent abroad to fight. He left Susan alone and pregnant, and in 1915, she gave birth to her and John's daughter, Janet. Within just weeks of Janet's birth, Susan received the news that her husband, John, had been killed in the trenches in North France. And from there is very little known about Susan or Janet from 1915 until 1922. And then that's when everything picks back up again. At this time, Janet was 7 years old, and Susan was approaching 30, when she fell in love with a 29-year-old worker named Jon Newell. And shortly after that, they were married. And for a short period of time, they lived happily, until after Christmas in 1922, when John was laid off from his job at the British Tube Works, along with many others as well. With so many workers unemployed and positions scarce to find, John was out of work for a whole 6 months. And during the time that he was off work, tempers became very frayed between him and Susan. They were arguing constantly, and they both began drinking very heavily. In one particular argument, in 1923, Susan took it further and attacked her husband. And it wasn't the first time that she had done this. John was left with his face bloody and bruised. He reported the assault at the local police station, but due to a lack of evidence and possibly the reluctance for police to get involved with the situation, it was determined to be a domestic dispute. The police didn't even go speak with Susan about the allegations also. Following this incident, Jon Newell decided to pack some bags, and he left his wife and stepdaughter. And just 3 weeks after him leaving, Susan was being evicted by her landlady. She was given notice to quit her lodgings, citing it unreasonable behavior as the reason. The following day, Wednesday, June the 20th of 1923, it was Carnival Day in Coatbridge. 13-year-old Jon Johnson, he was a street newspaper boy. On this particular day, so it was said that if sales wasn't that great in the streets, that John would take to knocking on people's door to see if they wanted the evening paper. And that day was one of those days. So to increase his sales, he began walking around to the houses and knocking on doors, hoping to sell more papers. At around 6:45 p.m., he knocked on the number 2 Newland Street, and he was knocking on the door of Susan Newell. She answered the door, and he was invited in by her. Once inside, Susan did take a newspaper from him. She opened it up and began to read it, and she made no attempt to pay him for it. That's when Jon Johnson asked her to pay for the paper that she had received, and an argument ensued between them. At this point, Susan lost control of herself, and that's when she began to strangle the poor little boy. Janet had been outside playing, and after playing, she came inside to see the boy's body laying on the sofa. Janet had to help Susan wrap him up into an old rug, and Susan had the problem then of what she was going to do with John's body. She went to sleep on the problem for the night, and in the morning, she had decided how she was going to dispose of his body. So Susan and Janet carried John's body that was wrapped in the rug downstairs and put it on an old pram that she had found. So with John rolled up in the rug and on the pram with Janet perched on top of him, they all set off together on foot, headed down Dundivan Road towards Glasgow. Several people noticed them as they walked around the roads towards Glasgow, and then they weren't seen again until around 9:30 a.m. Thomas Dixon, a delivery driver, saw a woman and a child walking along the road. The woman asked him if he could give her and her child with the pram a lift into Glasgow, as they were looking for a new place to stay. He agreed to help them, and he helped load the cart into his lorry before heading off into the city. Thomas Dixon let the pair off at Duke Street, but while helping unload the cart, it almost turned over and fell to the ground. Dixon managed to catch a hold of the cart to stop it from falling completely, but when he did, John became partially dislodged, and Jon Johnson's head protruded from under the rug, while his left foot came out of the bottom of the rug and was hanging over the edge of the cart. Susan managed to quickly shroud Jon Johnson back into the rug, and she thanked Dixon, and she said, quote, "I'll manage it, leave it alone," end quote. So Susan and Janet then walked off along Duke Street, but the incident had already been witnessed. So apparently, Dixon, the lorry driver, had failed to notice any of the boy coming out of the rug when that happened. But a lady who was looking out of her window of a nearby house, she did see him before Susan could cover up his body again. She decided to follow Susan and Janet and enlisted the help of her sister to go down an access lane next to number 630. One of them decided to go and get the police, while the other continued to watch the tenement building that Susan was headed towards. Robert Foote, a local resident, came out of a shop when one of the women shouted to him, quote, "There's a woman away up that entry and she's carrying a dead body," end quote. Newell had reached the end of the lane and found herself in the back court of the tenement. There was no exit there, except for the way that she had came in, or by climbing a 6-foot wall that separated the back courts from each other. Newell had been aware of the suspicion that she had aroused upon herself when she got out of the lorry, so she began to panic as she saw Robert Foote walking up the lane towards her. She immediately let go of the cart. She abandoned her 7-year-old daughter Janet, and she began climbing a 6-foot wall to get away. However, a passing police officer, Constable Thomas McGinnett, he had been alerted and appeared into the back court as Newell was halfway over the wall. He managed to take hold of her, pulled her off the wall, and placed her under arrest. Word had spread like wildfire already, and Duke Street was becoming a heavy mass of curious onlookers that hung their heads to show the respect of the body of Jon Johnson as he was carried out by the two constables. Susan had already worked out her story as well. If she was caught, she had already primed Janet with a story as well. She told the police that her husband had killed the boy and that she tried to stop him, but she couldn't. He was too strong. He had then forced her and Janet to dispose of his body for him. A post-mortem was carried out on the body of Jon Johnson, and it confirmed that the cause of his death was strangulation. The pathologist also noted that there had been recent burning to the boy's scalp and to the sides of his head as well. both of his ears had been completely burned off. It was unclear if these injuries were being caused as an attempt to destroy evidence or why she was burning. A search began to trace Jon Newell. Descriptions of him were passed off on newspapers, who printed them on their front pages. And on the 22nd of June, Jon Newell walked into the police station of the Headington West Lothian, handed them a copy of that day's newspaper, and told them that he was the man that they were looking for. Newell found himself arrested and in a cell. So at the trial, husband and wife, Jon and Susan Newell, they came to the trial in Glasgow on the 18th of September 1923 before Lord Alness. The case against Jon collapsed quickly, as he could prove that he was not in the house when the murder took place. He was able to provide several witnesses to prove his whereabouts, and the judge freed him immediately, saying that he should have never been brought to trial, so he left the dock where they were at without even giving a second look to Susan. From there, the main and most compelling evidence against Susan was given by her daughter Janet. She told the court how she had come back to the flat from playing outside to see the body of Jon lying on the sofa, and how she had helped her mother wrap him up. She also relayed to the court how she had helped her mother try to dispose of the body, and what her mother told her to say if they were questioned by the police. Susan had given Janet a full story that she was to tell of how her stepfather had killed Jon. In her defense, it was argued that Susan was insane, although this was rebutted by the prosecution's expert witness, Professor John Glaster, who he had examined her. Her counsel pointed out that the killing was not premeditated and had no obvious motive. The jury retired, and after 37 minutes they came back with a verdict. Somewhat surprisingly, in the view of the weight of the evidence, Susan was only convicted by a majority verdict. At least one of the jurors believed her defense of insanity. The jury unanimously recommended mercy. But the judge had no say in this matter, for Newell had been convicted of murder, for which the only punishment was death. Susan Newell showed no emotion as she was led from the dock and taken back to Duke Street Prison to await the execution. Here, she was examined by a psychiatrist, and she was found to be legally sane. No woman had been hanged in Scotland for over 50 years. There were considerable efforts made to secure a reprieve for Susan. However, the application of the law in Scotland had to be seen to be in line with that in England, where Edith Thompson had been hanged for what most of us would regard as a much less serious crime only 10 months earlier. So the Secretary of State for Scotland therefore decided that she could not be reprieved, and her execution was set for October the 10th, 1923. Susan showed emotion for the first time when she was told by the Lord Provost of Glasgow that there was to be no reprieve. She cried out for her daughter, and then she fainted. She was to be hanged by John Ellis, assisted by Robert Baxter, who together had also hanged Edith Thompson. Ellis disliked executing female prisoners and always seemed to have some sort of incident happen when he did. He was noted for the speed of which he conducted executions, and it was perhaps for wanting to get the procedure over with quickly and not wanting to hurt Susan, he did not pinion her wrist properly. Ellis decided to use the leather body belt that he had made for Edith Thompson, which had an additional strap to go around the thighs. This was necessary because the skirts at the time had gotten shorter over the years. There was concern that when she fell through the floor, that the wind would billow up her skirt as she fell. On the gallows, Susan allowed Baxter to strap her legs and thighs without protest, but she was able to get her hands free and loose from the straps on her body belt. and she defiantly pulled the white hood from her head, saying to Ellis, quote, "Don't put that thing over me," end quote. Rather than risk another trying scene, Ellis decided to proceed without it. The executioner pulled the trap door, and Susan Newell fell to her death, her unsecured arm flailing wildly as her eyes were wide open, staring at the assembled officials that surrounded the gallows. The executioner, John Ellis, later wrote that Susan Newell was not only the calmest person he had ever executed, but also the bravest. She became the last woman to hang in Scotland, and she was said to be the calmest person in the execution chamber, accepting her fate with both courage and dignity, although she never admitted to her crime. After the execution, Ellis resigned as the county's executioner-in-chief. He began drinking very heavily, and within 10 months of Newell's execution, he attempted to commit suicide by shooting himself in the head, but failed in the attempt. Eventually, he did kill himself, cutting his throat with an open razor in full view of family members. So some of the things about this case that never was really found out about was the motive. Why did Susan fly off the handle with Jon Johnson when she did? John's father even commented that at the time of when this happened, he wouldn't have had no more than 9 pence on him. So it was doubtful that she killed him for money. So, I mean, was it a case of just she lost her temper and just a moment of, in just a blind rage, just killed him? So this was an older case. I ran across this one. It was very interesting to me. I do like bringing these cases to you because they're long forgotten cases. A lot of these I don't think a lot of people's probably ever even heard of. So please jump in the comments. Tell me if you like hearing these old cases. If you have any recommendations of old cases or unknown cases, especially in the towns where you live, you're close to, or cases you've heard of, drop them in the comments. Shoot me an email if you want to with any kind of tips to any of these to look into. Besides that, that's going to be it for tonight. I hope everybody's enjoyed it. I appreciate everybody for being here with me. And until next time, good night, everybody.